Okay, good morning. Well, it's afternoon or evening in Australia, but we have our speaker today, and our topic today is the identity change of late-deafened adults after receiving a cochlear implant. So would you please introduce yourself, and we can talk a little bit about your work.
Thanks, Richard. I'm Felicity. I live in South Australia in a little rural town. I am a late-deafened adult who has received bilateral cochlear implants. My master's thesis was something that I had been thinking about for a very, very long time. The full thesis was titled Identity Effect of Hearing Changes, a qualitative exploration of late-deafened adults' experiences through hearing loss and cochlear implantation. And the reason I came to this was because it was part of my own experience, but I had also read so many comments from people who, on the social media platforms that we often visit, people saying, who am I now? Where do I fit? I don't understand how to be part of the world anymore. Now, for me, I was always a hearing person. I just couldn't hear. It was like I had this wonderful audio system where it worked perfectly, but there was a cord missing. And so the audio system was perfect. The speakers were perfect, but there was this cord missing. Inside, I was never deaf. I always considered myself a hearing person. I just couldn't hear. And I had pondered on this. Nobody ever, none of my audiologists, none of my doctors, specialists, or cochlear implant people ever considered asking me things about, how are you coping with this hearing loss? And so that's really where I came to the idea of approaching Macquarie University, where they have the Hearing Hub and they also have the Australian Institute for Health Innovation. And they do a lot of work in this particular area. And they accepted me, and I completed the master's in research, and in fact actually graduated last week.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We had to go to Sydney, which is, if you don't stop, it's a 14-hour drive, but we stopped off 2 or 3 places. And it was actually an amazing experience to be on campus for the first time, because I did this completely over Zoom. It is better in many ways for me to do it in distant, because as I experienced when I was at the university during the graduation ceremony, sometimes I could hear everything and understand everything the speaker was saying, but other times there were speakers I couldn't understand. And I know that if I were in a lecture theatre or anything like that, that I would sometimes have difficulty in understanding. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. You had some questions, Richard?
Well, my question here is basically, that's how you found your topic, which is great. And again, my congratulations on finally graduating. I know what a struggle it could be. My question is, now you found the topic, how did you go about your research itself? What was your thesis in working towards your thesis?
Okay. Obviously, I wanted to talk to only late-deafened adults, and it was during the COVID situation. So that actually precluded me going to clinics or doing anything face-to-face. So I started by developing an online survey, and these people were, the survey was put onto social media, including some of your groups, Richard, and I got answers from people who were prepared to both answer their hearing loss history as well as their cochlear implant history in that survey. And at the end of the survey, I asked if they were willing to be interviewed so that I could explore more the identity challenges that hearing loss created them, that they leave their email address. And from those people, I chose those who were willing to be interviewed. I think it was about 17 interviews, around about all of them over Zoom, of which I recorded them, put a backup recording as well, and then transcribed the interview and had them explain to me, first of all, their hearing loss history, their cochlear implant history, and then we discussed how it impacted on their identity.
What about your identity? Tell me a little bit about when you experienced the hearing loss. You said you missing these chords or missing these little pieces, but your identity itself, how did you actually feel? How did your hearing loss occur?
Well, nobody really knows how my hearing loss occurred. Possibly measles when I was about 9 years old, but it wasn't measured again until I was around 16. By the time I was 28, my left ear was completely deaf. Whether it had gone overnight or whether it had been slow and I'd just been, constantly adjusting, I don't really know. And then by the time I was 35, the other ear was completely deaf. I was also going through some trauma with the marriage breakdown and so on. So my hearing probably didn't get the attention that, I was busy rearing 3 children. I never ever felt that I was a deaf person. I was always a hearing person, but I did find there were lots of barriers to me getting jobs. For instance, I lost my job in part because of my hearing loss, and it took me 2 years to find another job. It was really difficult because the employers or potential employers couldn't see past the hearing loss. They couldn't see me as a person that was intelligent and so on, even though I was a hearing person. Now, after being deaf for about 25 to 30 years with only one very low-powered hearing aid trying to improve the sound, I did make a foray into the deaf community and started to learn sign language. I had no problem with these people. They accepted me fully. I found sign language fun, but it wasn't my language. And that foray taught me that I was a hearing person and that if possible, I wanted to hear. So that's kind of how I identified. I had been a musician and played the piano. I had done grade 7. I worked in the music industry. I played mood music in a restaurant and a bar. So I had anticipated that I would continue with that sort of thing, but of course I couldn't when the hearing loss happened. And possibly the first time I ever acknowledged the impact of hearing loss was the day I sold my piano. I had lost my job, but I couldn't find anything else. And with these 3 children who were now teenagers, I needed money to pay the rent. I hadn't played the piano for about 5 years. There was always this hope, I wanted that music. I wanted it back again. I wanted to continue to play it. But when I saw it being trundled down the driveway, it just absolutely broke my heart. And it was probably then that I made the admission that hearing loss had defeated me.
You were what I consider a refugee in the deaf world. It's the way I see it, because I had total deafness for 35 years and I never learned sign language. I was never part of the deaf community in that sense because my business and my family and my friends. So I understand this completely. All right, now you've had this heartbreak, you've had this epiphany. Did you go for a cochlear implant at that point, or when did you go for the cochlear implant?
No, that was back in about 1992. And in Australia, the cochlear implantation program was behind the rest of the world, despite the fact that it was developed here. It wasn't until 1995, I had moved to another state. I reached a really low point, a very low ebb. I was living alone. The children had grown and were doing their own thing. I was in a new city, couldn't make new friends easily. I tried to fix the things I could control. So I got myself a TV with subtitles, but in Australia, subtitles didn't become law until 2001. And so there was very limited stuff here, very limited equipment. Nobody knew anything about it, but I did all these things to try and take control of the things I could change. And one of those things was to start investigating a cochlear implant. I went to my GP, who had heard about it but didn't know anything about it. And she said she would find out for me. I had a fax machine, and so she found out and sent me the information, and I went and started having assessments for it. There was only one place in South Australia that was doing it, and they hadn't really done many implants at that point in time, probably only about 40 or 50 implants at that time. And I had to go on a waiting list. Pardon me. It took me 5 years to get to the top of that waiting list. And I was only number 94 implanted in South Australia.
Wow.
So it was a very long and slow process. The only way you could get an implant at that point in time was with government. The government provides the money, and they were providing about 9 implants a year in South Australia. Now, in the other states on the East Coast, that there were many, many more, but it's just that the program here hadn't really got going. I was implanted in 2002, and at switch on, I understood speech instantly in the completely deaf ear that had not had a hearing aid or any sound for 30 years. And of course, like everybody else, it didn't sound right, but that didn't take terribly long to fix itself up. And music followed about 2 months later, and I bought a new piano. So
I mean, this is fantastic, because a lot of the people that were listening to this, and I'll be discussing this with, obviously the emotional side of losing your hearing, you've covered amazingly. And your report is what we want to need to focus on now. How, after getting a cochlear implant, did your personality change, or what did you find the differences, and how did your life change? I know mine did. I want to hear your story.
Well, interestingly, I had met and married my husband while I was completely deaf. And so he knew how to communicate with me. And when the opportunity came up to have the cochlear implant, he wondered if I really needed it. Did he really want me to have it? Because would it impact on our lives? Would it change me so that it didn't need him quite so much? Look, it was probably a realistic question, but all it really did was make things easier. He does say that now that I can hear, I don't listen, when he considered I was an extremely good listener before. For me, what it did is confirmed that I was a hearing person. So before, I'd been a hearing person who couldn't hear, but now I was a hearing person who could hear. And my identity, I didn't return to my hearing identity. I had always maintained that. Perhaps there was an aspect of denial, which is pretty common for people, but inside I wasn't deaf. I was still always an intelligent and capable woman. But I just sometimes had difficulty conveying that to other people.
Well, denial is part and parcel of losing your hearing, because we know that people nod in agreement when they have no clue what's being said to them, and they laugh at jokes. They have no clue what the hell's going on. So we know denial is a very, very strong part of our personality when we lose our hearing. And did you get a piano again?
2 months after I started, I'll just show you.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. I want to know if you started to play in bars again. Did you play in bars and restaurants again?
No. I originally had 16 hours of repertoire without repeating anything, because I used to play and I could play 4 hours at a time. It's
I'm briefly going to interrupt you here, because you know one of the people that I've interviewed on my podcast. She was a lead singer for the New Christie Minstrels, and she said in that interview her favorite thing to do was to play in restaurants and bars. She loved performing for that small audience. Okay, all right. Now you've got your piano back. You got your life back. Your study itself. Did most people change after they received a cochlear implant in your study? When you talk about that a little bit,
there was probably about everybody in the study had a hearing identity. Often it was unrecognized, because until you lose it, you don't actually realize that you had hearing and it was part of your identity. And so about 30%, or I'd have to go and have a look at the figures, but they actually maintained their hearing identity during their hearing loss with some confusion. They would say, I am hearing, but sometimes I can't hear, or I mishear, or I'm hard of hearing. The people who had hearing loss slowly were more impacted by identity changes than the people who lost their hearing suddenly. Because the people who lost their hearing suddenly were still looking at medical issues. They wanted it fixed. So they'd lose their hearing in February, they'd go to the doctors, do all those injections and things that, the doctors try to do. And then the doctor would say, well, the only thing now is a cochlear implant. And within some months, they get a cochlear implant. So those people were hearing, identifying, and they remained that way. The people who went gradually deaf over a longer period of time had to make constant adjustments, and things changed for them all the time as their hearing degraded, when they had to change hearing aids or things like that. And those people seem to have more conflict about what and how they identified. So some of these, nevertheless, like me, were hearing and either remained hearing with a cochlear implant or returned to their hearing identity. There was a small percentage of people which surprisingly had not considered themselves deaf while they couldn't hear, but after they had their cochlear implant, they can now consider themselves deaf. We didn't have enough information and time, because it was a short study, to probe that further. But we feel that it was possibly because a cochlear implant is an absolute change. Whereas before, the hearing loss had been very gradual. Now there was an absolute change, and a number of them did qualify it by saying they were deaf because when they weren't wearing their processors, they couldn't hear anything. So there was a qualification there. Another thing that I found extremely interesting, and it was only probably about 30% of the people, not a huge number, and you can't generalize this across the whole cochlear implant population, had not considered themselves disabled while they couldn't hear. But after they'd had their cochlear implant, they now considered themselves disabled.
That's amazing. That's a fascinating fact. I had no clue. I've never actually, of the thousands of people I've spoken to, this is the first time I've ever heard that orientation toward getting a cochlear implant. So I hope you're going to do another study just on that narrow area.
Well, that was an interesting find. And again, it was something to do with having to always have processors on. One of the things was a possibility was that to get NDIS, which is the Australian disability system, and also in the similar things with the USA system, you have to admit or tick a box that says I'm disabled. And I actually spoke with a lawyer, and I think it was you that followed up with that lawyer. There are some qualifications that for you are considered disabled after having a cochlear implant for some time after receiving the implant. And it's possible, because I didn't have the opportunity to probe that was one of the reasons why some of these people chose that label.
It's a very, very small number that I've ever seen on any of the social media sites asking about how do I go on disability? Do I qualify? And it varies from state to state in the US. I think it's a huge step to take. And fortunately, I have seen very few who want to take that step. Almost everybody I know says, how do I get back to work? How do I make myself useful? How do I get my life back? So this is one of the things that attracted me to your study. What I'd like to do is put this video out there and get some discussion going. And maybe we can do a follow-up in a couple of months when we get some feedback from how people respond to it. It may lead you in a new direction of your theory as well. Okay. So I appreciate your time. I think this is going to have a huge impact on conversation because it comes from the heart. It comes from somebody who's walked that route. And I look forward to a future discussion with you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. And we will talk again very, very soon.